Esteemed resource person of the session, Dr. Binayak Dutta, respected principal, Dr. C. Sedalavi, head of the Department of English, Dr. Shahina Moleke, program coordinators, Mr. Shabir Mohan and Mr. Muhammad Ali, dignitaries, colleagues, friends, and students, a very warm good evening to one and all. I'm very delighted to welcome you to the fourth lecture titled Indian Partition, a Perspective from Northeast in the online interdisciplinary lecture series of the collaborative venture of the Department of English and Department of History, Karambail Ahmad Haji Memorial Unity Women's College, Manjeri. Indian independence, a moment which would otherwise be witnessed as the most fulfilling and relieving episode in the political history of India, was recorded as the most traumatic incident, with the death of millions and massive migrations owing to the partition it accompanied. Even after 73 years, the violence it unleashed and the split in the consciousness of India it brought in still burned the psyche of the subcontinent. Also, we are bound to confront the shift in the power equations too. Though the perceptions and ramifications on partition vary across geographical terrains, cultural realms, political landscapes, and gendered spheres, the truth of its immense potential to divide Indian consciousness that in turn poses threat to the coexistence of the communities remains absolute. This makes the discussion on partition pertinent in the 21st century. We have an expert on the subject, Dr. Binayak Dutta, Assistant Professor of the Department of History, Northeastern Hill University, Shillong, to provide a Northeast perspective on Indian partition, which, as far as I could understand, is fundamentally different from the popular narratives from Punjab and Bengal. He is a well-experienced teacher of more than 15 years of teaching experience, whose academic interests include citizenship in Northeast India, modern India, partition, displacement, and migration. He is a life member of Northeast Indian History Association, Shillong, Institute of Northeast India Studies, Kolkata, Folklore Society of Assam, and Assam Research Society, Guwahati. He did a project titled From Partition to Partition, a study of politics and impact of partition on Northeast India. He published 3 books and he has a lot of academic papers to his credits. On behalf of the Department of History and Research Club of the Department of English, K.A.H.M Unity Women's College, Manjeri, let me wholeheartedly welcome him to the platform of the online interdisciplinary lecture series. I would also extend a warm welcome to the participants to the session. I'm sure that our speakers' scholarly interventions into the topic will help us to translate our perceptions about partition beyond its generic content. Have a fruitful listening experience to each of you. Thank you very much. Now, let me invite our guest of honor to deliver the speech titled Indian Partition, a Perspective from Northeast. Over to you, sir. Thank you once again.
Thank you so much, ma'am. And before I start off with the lecture, may I take this opportunity to thank the Department of History, the Department of English, the Research Club of English, and the K.A.H.M Unity Women's College, Manjeri, for giving me this opportunity to interact with you. I would also express my gratitude to the principal of the college for kindly facilitating and agreeing to have me as one of the speakers. When I was invited by Professor Shabir Mohan, I thought, how do you think I could make some kind of a connection between what I want to speak about, and that is the partition of India in the Northeastern sector, and with friends who have invited me so kindly in Kerala. And then I thought that, there are some fundamental, preliminary points that I would like to assert before I get on to discussing the basic lecture that I have to give today. If the history of human civilization, one of the things that we actually see that it is, and even before civilization, the history of mankind has been the history of intercommunity contacts through trade, and more so with civilization, the contact through trade, migration, and urbanization. It is important to remember that the idea of partition or hardline territorialization of the globe is a process that begins in the modern sense with the gradual entrenchment of the nation states that encompass two contradictory forces, one being the force of consolidation and the other being the force of fragmentation. Incidentally, a few years back, a very interesting book came out. And the title of the book was called Partitions. And one of the essays in that book by a scholar by the name of Rada Ivekovic did point out something very, very fundamental, that essentially the idea of partition is connected with the forceful expansion of the Western kind of modernity that we actually see across the globe. And in that sense, the way in which we understand partition in the modern sense is very, very different from the idea of borders and boundaries that we had in the pre-modern world. In drawing borders over boundaries, the idea of partition becomes a counter to the original reality of a borderless, seamless interaction between people to people, transfer of goods, and transfer of ideas. Therefore, when I thought about this lecture, I thought it would be interesting to interact with my friends at Kerala and through them to the world, because Kerala, as you know, and as we celebrate Kerala as basically the repository of a civilizational connectivity heritage. And it would be interesting to actually interact through Kerala, which has been the symbol of connectivity, the symbol of continuity and connectivity over generations, over civilizations, and Northeast India, which is basically a land that is a product of partitions and boundary demarcation. The narrative of borders and boundaries as an idea of a limit, is not something very new. But what has changed in the context of the modern world, in the context of the emergence of the modern nation states, the context of the introduction of Western type of modernity, is that this narrative has to be understood in the context of drawing borders as the zones or the lines of maximal force and maximal closure. I'm often reminded of what Rabindranath Tagore had said in his great poem, which I'm sure has become a universal knowledge now, which is called Where the Mind is Without Fear. And, one of the things that he talks about is the idea of narrow domestic walls. The way we look at borders now, the way we look at borders and boundaries now, is in the context of narrow domestic walls in the language of Rabindranath Tagore. And the process of making those walls is what I understand as partition. The introduction of this idea of borders as different from the age of empires, which is very different from the age of empires, because in those days, borders was not essentially an idea of a limit of people. In fact, despite the existence of empires which had very defined borders, people continued to migrate over spaces. There was migration, there was contact, there was settlement, there was interaction of people. But with the new system, with the new order, you see that the idea of borders undergo a change. As Noah Harari, in one of his, recent, because it's published in 2011, a book called Sapiens, essentially points out that the empires, in the pre-modern world, the empires were characterized by flexible borders and a potentially unlimited appetite, facilitated by cultural diversity and territorial flexibility. Borders continued to shift over time. But today it's not the same. In today's world, which is dominated by nation states, the idea of limits has expanded beyond the political context. It's just not about limiting the political authority. It is also about limiting the fluid interactions that characterized the pre-modern world. And so, therefore, it is not only a limit to fluid socioeconomic interaction among people, but it is also a limit, which is governed by the idea of surveillance. And so, therefore, the barbed wire fence, the border security force, the institution of documentation which assert belongingness, rootedness, and otherness, it's important to understand in the modern nation state context that when you talk about us, when you talk about a nation state with defined borders, you're also talking about them who are not part of you. So this idea of belongingness, rootedness, and otherness, represented in the ideas and institutions such as citizenship, such as passport, all make the idea of borders and boundaries very different from what it was earlier. In this context, I want to locate the discussion of partition of Northeast India. Friends, at the very outset, I would like to point out that the modern India, which came to life, of course, there can be a debate on what was India, whether India was a civilizational state or not. I'm not getting into all of that debate right now. But what I can actually share with you is that with the coming in of with the construction of modern India, and how is this modern India being constructed? This modern India was being constructed in this interaction between colonial modernity on the one hand, represented first by the English East India Company and then by the British Crown, and the Indian subcontinent, of which the reason why we talk about the subcontinent is that the subcontinent was part of a larger Asian continent. So India was basically geopolitically located in South Asia, southern part of Asia, and it was basically at the meeting place between East Asia and Asia Major. But this whole idea of construction of a modern India with very, very clearly defined territory, with very, very clearly defined borders, is something that actually evolves with the coming in of colonial modernity. And along with this coming in of colonial modernity, you also see the creation of what is called Northeast India. So, when I started off my lecture by saying that Northeast India is a land which is actually created by partition, and that way it's very, very interesting to interact with friends from Kerala who've actually not seen partition in the sense that I'm talking about, the creation of a region through partition. So it's a very interesting interaction, and where we actually see along with the evolution of modern India, the creation of an India which is very, very clearly demarcated with very, very clearly defined borders. So therefore, India, when you look at India, India is, at least even before 1947, was a land which was surely not something which was very undefined, because with the coming in of the colonial state, we are conscious about the fact that India was gradually getting defined. I'm actually reminded of a very interesting lecture that Lord Curzon, we all have heard about Lord Curzon, a man who was a viceroy, governor general and viceroy in India. And when Curzon went back to England in 1905, Curzon was invited to give a lecture at Oxford. And Curzon was extremely apprehensive. He said that, see, and if you look at the preface to his lecture, Curzon says that, I decided to take time. And so he took about a year, and he went back to England in 2000, in 1905. And in 1907, Curzon delivered that lecture at Oxford. And that lecture is called the Romance Lecture. And in that lecture, Curzon actually, because, this whole idea of demarcation of borders, with very, very clearly defined boundary lines, is something that was institutionalized in the pan-Indian sense by Curzon, who took the credit for drawing the Durand Line. Durand Line, as you know, separates, the Indian subcontinent from Afghanistan. So in that sense, very, very interesting kind of a situation was being created as a result of the coming in of colonial rule. So therefore, Curzon points out that in Asiatic countries, and he's very honest when he actually points that out, he says in Asiatic countries, it would be true to say that demarcation has never taken place. And he actually accepts the responsibility. He says demarcation has never taken place except under European pressure and by the intervention of European agents. Now, European pressure and European agents is what actually brings us to the history of Northeast India. As I said, that when we're talking about this boundary demarcating India, partly India that was being created by the colonial state, and partly the India that actually also brings in Northeast India into its fold, one of the things that I do want to say, and say very, very clearly, is that the Northeast as a category is not actually, the term Northeast actually denotes a direction. But it actually, in geopolitical sense, denotes a direction, a land which is located at the northeast of Bengal. So in that sense, Eastern frontier, that's how it was first discussed. And, you actually see how this entire eastern frontier, east of what? East of Bengal. So eastern frontier of Bengal was gradually being carved out through a series of boundary demarcation. And this boundary demarcation was something that we actually see taking place from a very, very long time. And this taking place over a long time means that, when you start talking about partition, when you start talking about partition in India, and if you look into most of the history books, one of the things that you will invariably see is that we go back to 1947 and we say India was partitioned in 1947. I want to basically share a different experience, because I want to argue that India was actually created by partitions. And a major part of that partition actually takes place in what we understand today as Northeast India. And the process of boundary demarcation in Northeast India actually starts off in the context of that boundary demarcation actually starts off in the context of the Khasi and Jaintia hills. Friends who have come to Northeast India, and especially who have come to Shillong, would know that Shillong is basically the capital of Meghalaya, and Meghalaya is basically the homeland of three major communities: the Khasi, the Jaintia, and the Garo. And these are the indigenous communities who actually who basically constitute the primary indigenous communities who comprise the state of Meghalaya. Now, so when we start talking about partition, the first partition in that sense that takes place in 1772, mind you, we are far away from 1947. 1772 is the boundary demarcation across Sylhet, the northern boundary of Sylhet, which actually cuts into the habitat, the living space of the Khasi Jaintia community. And it's very, very interesting to see how this boundary demarcation takes place as a result of the intervention of what Curzon called European pressure and the intervention of European agents. So, what was the European pressure? And this is something that we need to understand, because when you start looking at the making of modern India, one of the reasons why the English East India Company came to India, and this is fairly well established, is that they had essentially deep rooted commercial interests. And in the Khasi Jaintia areas, that was not just a simple area, it was a source of varied raw materials, extremely rich mineral resources. And in that sense, when you start looking at the boundary demarcation, the history of boundary demarcation in Northeast India starts off by demarcating the boundary of the Khasi Jaintia territories. So the indigenous communities were limited to the hills, while the English East India Company took control over the foothills, which actually had the mineral resources, and the plains, which were actually moving on to the plains of Sylhet. Now, having said that, I also want to draw your attention to the fact that boundary demarcation did not finish only with the Khasi Jaintias. The next set of boundary demarcations that we actually see happens in Tripura. Now, Tripura is the other very, very interesting state of Northeast India. As you know, that it's one of the many princely states. In India, we had more than 560 princely states. In Kerala, friends are familiar with the princely state of Travancore. In Northeast India also, we had a number of princely states. And one of the princely states was Tripura. And so the second boundary demarcation that actually takes place in Northeast India in the 18th century itself is Tripura, where, the demarcation takes place in 1782. Not in the hardcore sense, because the process of actually drawing boundary lines, erection of pillars, all this happens by around 1854 to 1857. But but when you start looking at the process actually begins in 1782. So if the first set of boundary demarcations take place in the construction of India and Northeast India, colonial India and Northeast India in 1772, the next happens just 10 years after that in 1782. But that's not the only set of demarcations that we're talking about. By the 18th century, we see two demarcations, very clear demarcations: the Khasi Jaintia territory, the territory of Tripura, where the hills Tripura and the plains Tripura are essentially divided, because hills Tripura becomes the territory which is being controlled by the Maharaja of Tripura, while the plains Tripura is being controlled by the English East India Company. But in the 19th century, the process becomes more and more acute. And this is something that I want to draw your attention to. In the 19th century, as I said, that the process of boundary demarcation acquires deeper roots. And so therefore, not just Tripura, not just the Khasi Jaintia hills, you also see boundary demarcation taking place in Manipur. And so therefore, that's the other princely state. It's very, very interesting to see how these princely states essentially, flourished across regions, both the hills and the plains, and how the coming in of the English East India Company decided to create boundaries which actually bifurcated, separated people within communities. It actually partitioned communities. And this is why we need to understand how the process of partition, the project of separation of communities from within, cutting, separating communities from within, is something that is much deeper than just 1947. When you start looking at partition of Manipur, you see the construction of a line, again, a process that actually extends over a long period of time. It starts off by 1830s with some amount of survey, with some amount of attempt by a colonial agent. I'm going back to Curzon's words, except under European pressure and except under the supervision of European agents. So I'm going to talk about three people who are European agents and who invariably play a very, very important role in the process of partition of Manipur. Now, friends, this partition of Manipur becomes important because when you're talking about India, you're also talking about the boundary that India shares with Burma, and when you're trying to talk about Burma, we'll actually see how this partition of, this boundary demarcation that you actually see developing in the 19th century, insofar as Tripura is concerned, actually becomes more and more formalized over a period of time till about 1948, when Burma gains its independence, 1947 when India gains its independence, and 1937 when Burma is politically separated from India to constitute into a separate administrative unit. So this whole idea of demarcation of borders and boundaries is something that is much, much deeper than what we have so far understood. This is the context, which just one or two more points before I start talking about 1947, which actually is there in our memory and which gets revised, which gets revived and revised into our memory, into our mindscape, as a result of political happenings and situations. But before I talk about that, I want to talk about two things. One, that in the beginning of the 20th century, you actually see the separation of Tibet from what is called territories controlled by the British government in northeastern frontier tracts. And so therefore, and this separation that actually goes on demarcating Tibet and India is carried on and is named after the British negotiator, plenipotentiary, the British negotiator who negotiated that boundary demarcation by the name of Henry McMahon. And so therefore, if you ever have an opportunity to visit Arunachal, you would probably realize that the northern boundary of Arunachal is actually, as India claims, is the McMahon line. And this was actually as a result of an agreement that was concluded by 1914. We remember 1914 for the First World War, but in India, in Northeast India, we remember 1914 also, July 1914, also for that boundary demarcation, which we know as the McMahon line. In 1937, we actually see the separation of Burma from India. And the result of that separation of Burma from India ultimately sees that a number of indigenous communities are separated, from within, partitioned from within. One of the things that I want to highlight here is there are two ways of looking at partition. One way of looking at partition is how communities look at partition. This community understanding of partition is not only reflective of the partition that we talk about in Northeast India, across, when this line is being drawn, across Manipur, across Nagaland, and then Arunachal Pradesh, you will probably see, or even Mizoram. I'm sure you're familiar, even while most of you might not have visited these places, you're familiar with these terms because they are all constituent states of the Indian Union. One of the things that you will probably appreciate is that the boundaries that actually I've spoken about the the line that separated Manipur initially and then, of course, was drawn right across. That's drawn up by three European agents. We know the name of Pemberton, R.B. Pemberton. We know the name of Maxwell, and we know the name of Johnstone. Three agents, basically the agents of the English East India Company and then the British Crown in Northeast India, in Manipur. And they are actually responsible for creation of that demarcating line, that line that initially was an administrative separating line between India and what we understand as Burma, but which later on acquired post 1937 and post 1947 and 48 a more character of an international boundary. But what is the result of that process of separation in 1937? The result of that process of separation of 1937 is that across provinces like Arunachal, Manipur, Mizoram, and Nagaland, you have various indigenous communities getting partitioned. So you have the Konyaks, you have the Kukis, you have the Mizo, the Paite, the Chin, you have the Chakesangs, you have the Sangtams, you have the Kimungans, you have the Konyaks, you have the Wangchus, you have the Singphos, you have the Thangchas. Now, these are some of the indigenous communities in that particular area that I've spoken about, spread across the four northeastern states of Arunachal, Manipur, Mizoram, and Nagaland. Now, having said that, I now want to shift from 1937 to 1947. Now, in 1947, when it was decided that India would be, the power would be transferred in India, when the British government decided to hand over power, it was actually not a very, very easy process. And it was not an easy process because the English East India Company, which had started the demarcation, followed by the British Crown, all these demarcations were actually getting legitimized in 1947. In 1947, you have a decision by the Viceroy, Lord Mountbatten, that if India is partitioned, then two other provinces will also be partitioned, and that is Punjab and Bengal. Ma'am, who introduced me today in the morning, at the beginning of this presentation, did refer to Punjab and Bengal. But if you look to the archival records, you will probably see that along with Punjab and Bengal, what is mentioned in the archival record is that the Viceroy is actually pointing, or Lord Mountbatten is pointing out, that if Bengal is partitioned, then a referendum will be taking place in Sylhet. Now, referendum is a political process by which you actually go to the people of a particular area on one political question. And in this case, the political question was that, when India was being divided into India and Pakistan, whether that particular area, and, here we are talking about Sylhet. And when I'm talking about Sylhet, Sylhet is not a province. Sylhet is a district, a southern district of the then colonial province of Assam. So they go back to that district, and I can only tell you that there was a referendum, and there was a referendum is a political process. It was very colorful. It was extremely aggressive, and it is also a very, very important point of difference between partition in Bengal and Punjab and partition in Northeast India. Because in Northeast India, partition actually takes place through what is called a referendum. Referendum becomes the foundation on which partition takes place. But there is another reason why I refer to the Sylhet referendum. One of the things, friends, that we actually see that has been institutionalized by textbooks, even in our common understanding, that there is an understanding that India was divided on the basis of religion, and that Hindus and Muslims decided to part ways. And, the Muslims wanted Pakistan. That is not true, because while a large chunk of the people might have wanted Pakistan, Northeast India actually goes on to show that there are a substantial section of the Muslims who did not believe in the idea of partition, who fought against their own co-religionist brothers who were wanting partition, who were wanting Pakistan, and they fought against them. And these Muslims were known as the Jamiat Ulema Hind. As you know, that the Jamiat Ulema Hind essentially drew its sustenance from Deoband. Deoband is a seminary which is in UP. And, we see the head of that seminary, Maulana Madani, coming to Assam in 1946, and his followers playing a very, very interesting and a very aggressive role in campaigning along with the Congress, along with the Communist Party, against partition of Assam, against taking Sylhet and Assam out of India into Pakistan. So one of the reasons why I want to talk about that particular point is that it breaks the stereotype of a binary, as if partition was actually a binary that was created on the basis of religion. I want to very, very consciously point out that we need to understand the sacrifice of these Muslim brothers who are Jamiatis, who are members of the Jamiatul Ulema Hind, who actually fought tooth and nail against the Muslim League, and who actually very strongly believed that they wanted to remain, they wanted to keep Northeast, especially the southern district of Assam, as part of undivided India. Having said that, that is one of the reasons why I talk about Northeast. And that is why Northeast becomes such an interesting site in partition, in understanding partition, because Northeast actually tells you that this binary, the religious binary that we have been hearing about right from 1947, is actually not the whole picture that we should be having. The second important thing that I want to talk about is that, these people who had opposed the Muslim League, they suffered tremendously. And in fact, the suffering was such that they could not remain in East Pakistan. As a result of partition, Pakistan as a state was created with two wings. One is the West Pakistan, and the other is East Pakistan, what is now Bangladesh. And in East Pakistan, these people who were the Jamiatis could not continue there for a long time because they were vilified. There was witch hunting. They were searched out, and they were actually treated very, very cruelly, and they were forced to migrate to India between 1947 and 1950. So that is one of the ways in which one looks at partition. The other way in which one looks at partition is that, when you start talking about partition, you have to also understand that partition is just not a story of Hindus and Muslims. Because while along with the Hindus and Muslims, the other question, which is the religious question, the other question that actually stood out in the context of partition in Northeast India is ethno-linguistic politics. And it's very, very important for us as students of history to understand that there is no one reason why you actually talk about partition. We have been hearing over and over again that there is just one reason. In reality, there are many reasons. And one of the reasons is not religious, it's ethno-linguistic, where there was a constant conflict between two dominant communities in Assam, namely the Assamese and the Bengali. I think it's important for me to also point out that while we talk about the dominant discourse, while we do talk about partition as in the rest of the country, as in Punjab and Bengal, we also have to understand that we need to recognize that a vast number of indigenous communities, were adversely affected. They lost their lands. They also lost their habitat. They were forced to migrate. They lost their livelihood. They were almost brought to the brink of death because of starvation. And this is something that we don't talk about when we talk about partition. We talk a lot about violence. Of course, we'll talk about violence because partition of India was not a very peaceful process. It was something that even in West India, in Punjab, 15 million people lost their homes and about 1 million people lost their lives. In Bengal, it was equally traumatic because in partition in Northeast is not something that happened in 1 year or 2 years. It is not something that is related to just 1947 and 1948. It's something that continued right up to 1971 or even beyond, And in that sense, it's just not about people. I want to probably also highlight that partition also destroyed the connectivity. In India, when you talk about connectivity, as I've shared, and as I've acknowledged, our friends in Kerala would invariably know that they are the hub of connectivity, global connectivity, right from the time of the Romans right into Vasco da Gama's time, and even now, they are the hub of connectivity. But in Northeast was also the hub of connectivity because Northeast, as you understand, was actually linked with, the South Asia through Chittagong, through ports in what is now Bangladesh. And this connectivity was disrupted as a result of partition. So while we talk about partition, we talk about the human factor. We don't much talk about the economic factor, the economic fallout, actually, not factor, the fallout of partition. But I want to, I've been speaking for quite some time. I want to draw your attention to why partition of Northeast is actually quite relevant to the friends from other parts of the country as well. As a result of partition, there are 2-3 things that happened. One, for the first time, you actually see the foreigners dimension. As I said, that moment you create these boundary lines and you say, okay, this is the limit of my country, you are actually also admitting that beyond the line, beyond the limit is the other country. So people who were earlier part of a free-flowing geospace, geopolitical space, which, as I said, was changing boundary, because in the age of empires or in the age of kingdoms, these boundary lines actually affected the rule of kings, but it did not affect the migration of people. It did not affect trade. It did not affect connectivity. But as a result of the partition in 1947, and of course, 37 to 47, and what was later on institutionalized, you actually see how, people were actually identified as foreigners. So the foreigners dimension came about as a big way with 2 things. One, boundary demarcation. And in 1952, you have what is called the introduction of the passport system. In October 1952, you have the introduction of the passport system, and then you have the institutionalization of what is called the idea of a foreigner in Indian politics. Of course, in Indian law, but I don't want to talk about law here because that would essentially be another lecture. But one of the things that I would like to talk about is that in this context, it's very, very pertinent to point out that the foreigners issue has played a very, very important role in our understanding of Northeast India, and through Northeast India, which has a ramification across the country. In Northeast India, as a result of this foreigners question, you actually see the introduction of what is called the NRC. NRC, the National Register for Citizenship, or National Register of Citizens, is something that actually is implemented under the direction of, the encouragement of the governments and the direction of the Supreme Court in Assam. So Assam becomes the pilot project of the NRC. And that there are discussions where people have high functionaries, highly placed, sources have actually spoken about a nationwide NRC. And one of the offshoots of that NRC in Assam has been obviously first in the first list, the segregation of 40 lakhs of people as foreigners, which was by the final list brought down to 19 lakhs. We still don't know what is going to happen to these 19 lakhs, whether these 19 lakhs are foreigners. Because the moment you say that you belong, and not only that, there is this huge problem that happens as a result of these foreigners dimension, because you start identifying people on the basis of their language and culture with a particular neighboring country. And the neighboring country essentially says that no, they are not our people. They're not my people at all. So what happens to these 19 lakhs of people, who are, out of which at least 11 lakhs, admittedly, are people who speak the same language, while they differ in terms of religion. So what happens to them? How do they actually overcome this difficulty? The second thing that happens, and that is the introduction of the Citizenship Amendment Act. I don't want to get into too much of a controversial discussion right now. I've been speaking for about 40-45 minutes. I would be willing to take questions if it arose on these issues, but I can only tell you that Northeast partition is very, very interesting, because Northeast actually is the site that actually tells us how communities were partitioned. It also tells us how we continue to be partitioned, and despite the passage of about 74 years, and how if the system that is introduced in Northeast India, if that is made into a nationwide discourse, it could have wide-ranging ramifications in other parts of the country as well. It's just not about our region. It's about how this region actually becomes, a testing ground for policies that in that case could start affecting people from other parts of the country as well. I just want to close this discussion by pointing out that, as a student of history, and as a student, I see that this platform that has been offered to me has also been, also been courtesy the Research Club of English. And one of the things that you'd probably remember is that every time we talk about partition, we talk about citizenship, we talk about displacement, we talk about migration, we are actually talking about songs, poems, graffiti, and slogans. It's important to just not stick to the archives. It's important to move beyond the archives to talk about how human experiences can be incorporated into our writings by developing an interdisciplinary perspective where we look beyond our own disciplines. Historians have been taught about the archives, but we also need to learn from other disciplines like literature, because they invariably talk about emotions. Nobody captures emotions better than literature. And so in that sense, I think it's very, very important to engage across disciplines to understand human experiences. Partition is basically the story of human experiences. The last thing that I want to say is that when we start talking about partition, the reason why we talk about Northeast India and why Northeast India is important is that if you look into the proceedings of the Indian History Congress, or if you look at the writings of people like Romila Thapar, or if you look at the writings of Bhairavi Prasad Shahu, or if you look at you look at other scholars who talk about regions, it's important to study regional history, because regional history can give you an understanding of historical situations at a more micro level. It's important to understand that India is a very, very diverse country, and this diversity is basically reflective of its numerous regions, each region having its own specificities. The idea is to actually have a shared experience, learn from each other, and realize that while if you look at other regions, probably you can get a hint about how larger national and global policies affect ourselves. I want to thank the college, the K.A.H.M Unity Women's College, the principal of the college, the Department of History, and the Department of English and the Research Club of English for giving me this opportunity to share my ideas with you. I'm sure we I mean, it's a great honor for me to share my ideas, because it's something that I had thought about. You are basically God's own country, I had thought about interacting with you at some point, but I thank the institution for facilitating this interaction. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, sir, for such an informative session. We are really grateful to you for delivering such a talk that made us realize that an event is no more an event. An event called partition is both an event and progression. Also, it enlightened us on how disciplines such as history, geography, politics, and literature conflate with each other and encroach into the existence of citizens and communities. Thank you very much once again for such a lovely talk. And now the time has arrived for discussions, comments, and clarifications. If anyone has any question, you can either switch on your microphone and ask, or you can put it in the chat box.
Yes, Binayak sir, let me ask a question. I don't know not much about the so-called Silhat referendum, but I read that this Silhat referendum is so important for the partition experience in Assam and Northeast. So why so?
Yeah, can I answer?
Yes.
See, one of the things that I would like to assert here is that the Sylhet experience essentially tells us that partition cannot be studied in a homogeneous manner. So partition of Punjab, partition of Bengal, and partition of Assam cannot be placed on the same footing. It has its own dimensions, which invariably has its own specificities. That's one. The second important thing that we probably need to take on board is that the Sylhet referendum, as I told you, gives us a very, very interesting dimension about how culture, politics, and geography combine together to produce a narrative which is very, very distinct and different. The third important point is that it helps us to break certain stereotypes. It helps us to break the stereotype that, partition is a story of Hindus versus the Muslims. It helps us to break this idea because, invariably you see the Hindus and Muslims all combining together to resist the partition of the country. And this is something which is spectacular. And because this is something that helps us to argue that, you should not essentially talk about partition only in terms of religion. Partition is something which is definitely more diverse and more detailed than just understanding it in very, very simple binary terms.
I'll just read out the questions from you.
Please. Yeah.
This is a question from Deepthi Menon. The question is this: has the partition affected the gender equations of the region?
Yeah, of course it has, because one of the things that you will probably appreciate that when you start looking at the idea of gender stereotypes in a patriarchal society, even in slightly middle class homes, and of course in elite homes, the idea of the indoor and the outdoor. The outside world was the world of men, and the world of women was essentially the domestic. Partition actually breaks the house, and in the process also breaks these stereotypes about house. So when men and women both came out on the street, were displaced from their homes, and in refugee and decided and were forced to stay in refugee rehabilitation centers, the strict stereotype of space binaries, the stereotype of patriarchal stereotype of men and women, the space of men and the space of women actually starts crumbling down. The second thing is, and this is something that also gets reflected in cinema, cinema, the other side, which becomes a very, very interesting source of perception about partition, And one actually sees how filmmakers, movie makers like Ritvik Ghatak is a very, very interesting, is a globally known Bengali, movie maker. And he shows us how women are forced to go out of their home and search a job. And while earlier, the idea of women essentially was to limit them to the domestic space, in post-partition situations, they were forced to come out and probably also share the burden of running a household along with the men. So it definitely contributes to breaking the gender stereotypes that you actually see. It helps to break down the gender roles, reformulate the gender roles actually in partition areas. So in Bengal, in Assam, so it definitely helps us how the gender roles get actually transformed as a result of partition.
Okay, sir. There is another question from Gunjan Chaturvedi. Can you refer to some literary works that reflect partition of the northern east in the sense as has been articulated by you?
When I talk about partition and Northeast India, there are some works which are historical works. One of the works is by a historian from Northeast by the name of Manjeri Dutta Pathak, and her book "You Do Not Belong Here" is a very, very interesting narrative of partition experiences in what is the core of Northeast India, especially the state of Assam, which is the Brahmaputra Valley. So the title of the book is "You Do Not Belong Here." Then you also have a book by somebody called Anindita Dasgupta. Her name is important because she is one of the earliest scholars to have recovered the memory and narrative of the people, common people. And her book is called Remembering Sylhet. Beyond that, I will come to literary works. But I want to start off with historical works actually. The third book that I want to talk about is a book by a senior colleague of ours in Northeast India. His name is Pradeep Thanjavbam. And Pradeep's book, The Northeast Question, is a very, very interesting book on this question of partition, because it talks about partition in Manipur. I talked about Manipur to some extent. It talks about that experience. Then there is a book by Dilip Gogoi, which is called Making on Northeast, which is a good book because it gives us certain very important information. Then you have by Anindita Kothal. The book has a lot of problems, but it's important to remember that while the book has a problem, it's a book which has basically come out. So it's important to refer to that book as well as a published important published source. One can actually one can find out issues with that book. But it is a published text. So I've spoken about that. There are also books of autobiographical nature, and these are mostly in the vernacular. And these vernacular texts, which are written in Bengali, which are written in Assamese, which are some of the dominant languages, also give us very interesting insight about partition experiences. Insofar as indigenous communities, there is a book which is very interesting, which is called Secret Lands Where Women Reign. And Secret Lands Where Women Reign is a book on the Khasi and the Garo community. And it's very, very interesting to see how that particular book talks about partition experience. It's so very, very marginal, a small nugget, but it's an interesting book. But most of the experiences, if you really want to talk about people's experiences, these have to be covered from other languages.
Okay, sir. Thank you very much. And I'm sure that this list will be very much helpful, not only for the students of history, but also for the students of literature too. And there is a third question. Please explain the connections between partition in Northeast and NRC in Assam.
Well, when you know it, this is a very interesting question because NRC is a process that actually gets implemented between 2014, when the Supreme Court in December 2014 passes an order or a judgment, as they actually indicate in that order. It's a judgment which actually says that an NRC should be conducted in Assam. But it does not stop there. When you look at that particular judgment, which institutionalizes the process of NRC, one actually sees it with something called an NRC of 1951. And if you link NRC 2014-2019 to the NRC of 1951, it is not only problematic, but it actually relates the NRC of 2014 to the experience of partition. Because one of the things that you have to remember that NRC 1951 is a product of the Census Act of 1948. And the Census Act of 1948, which is basically the process, the legal framework through which the enumeration of the people living within the country is concerned, it is a product of partition of 1947 and the product of decolonization. So in that, this is one of the ways in which NRC gets related to the process of partition. The other process, the other way in which NRC 2014 gets related to the process of partition is through what is called a legacy data. A legacy data is trying to relate the people who are staying in Assam to their ancestors who were staying in Assam post 1947. And this is a very, very, very interesting and a very, very painful process because, as you know, that in this country, we do not have proper documentation. I have written about it, which is, and it's in public domain. Now, my writing is in public domain, where I have pointed out that when you start thinking the NRCs in the legacy data, one of the elements of the legacy data is the refugee rehabilitation card. And this refugee rehabilitation, who's a refugee? A refugee is somebody who migrates into India in the context of NRC in Assam. A refugee is somebody who migrates into Assam as a result of partition, and he comes and he takes he gets a formal letter of accreditation, which says that yes, you are a refugee and you have decided to, forego all your links with East Pakistan, and you are now planning to reside in Northeast India. So in that sense, both through the legacy data and through the linkage with NRC 1951, the NRC of 2014-2019 gets some kind of a linkage with the process of partition of 1947.
Sir, this is a question from Anuradha Kumari. What do you think? Why partition of Bengal and Northeast is silenced when we talk or study partition of India? Is it because in most literary texts or cinema portray Punjab and its pain?
See, when you talk about this kind of a silence, apart from saying that there is a politics of silence and there is a politics of location, Punjab is closer to Delhi. Northeast and Bengal is actually quite far away. But it's also, that's one of the reasons. The other reason, apart from geography, is that in Northeast, partition is a life story. People still are victimized, people are still tormented. If you say that you are from the other side of the border, and then you are actually called a foreigner, So nobody wants to actually say that he has any roots or links on the other side of the border, because you then get stigmatized as a foreigner. And because you speak a particular language, you belong to a particular religious community, so you invariably end up, getting stigmatized, and people say, okay, so we have a foreigner in our midst. So people don't want to own either their identity or own their narrative. In Punjab, partition is a story of sacrifice, and thanks to the government of India, which has actually recognized Punjabi partition victims as martyrs, they have sacrificed their lives. But the government of India, unlike in the situation in Punjab, at least in the early parts of the Indian post-independent India, were extremely unhappy with displacement and settlement of refugees. So government was reticent towards refugee rehabilitation, and they wanted people who had displaced themselves because of violence, because of partition trauma. The people, they were told that, no, you go back to East Pakistan. People were not in a position to go back to East Pakistan because the political situation there was extremely hostile. But this was something that the government of India was not willing to recognize. And as a result of that, people continued to stay but remained silent. They became quiet. They did not want to talk about their experience of migration and settlement, because they felt that any discussion of that migration and settlement would lead to stigmatization and victimization. And this is a process that continues even today. So it's because of this process of victimization. NRC, if you look into the process of NRC, while there is no problems in any country having a register of citizens of its own. Now that we have come to recognize the legitimacy of nation states with defined boundaries. But the way in which the processes have been conducted, the way in which the process has been undertaken, invariably tells us that things have really not gone very, very well insofar as the experience of people are concerned. And because of their very, very violent, very, very unhappy experience, partition continues to remain a story that people don't want to talk about. Apart from the government apathy, if you look into even standard textbooks, at some point I was much younger, and I actually stood up in a conference, and I ended up saying that even standard textbooks like Modern India, which is a must read for students of class 11 and 12, which is published by NCERT, that has just one paragraph on partition. And that too, almost like an apology. It says that, while some people suffered as a result of partition, the rest of the country were very, very happy and they were celebrating independence. So this binary between partition and independence, we need to remember that partition actually preceded independence. If India got its independence on the 15th of August, partition of India happened on the 14th of August. So we need to understand that partition and independence are two sides of the same story. But this is something that we, at least the government of India, had not encouraged for a very, very long time. And, that's why people were silent. And now that there are some discussions about it, that the way in which we are discussing this entire issue is also fraught with a lot of misgivings and a lot of problems. We need to iron out these problems. But undoubtedly, there is no denial that people need to talk about it. People need to write it. We are already very late, because most of the people who have experienced partition or who could have probably remembered partition are already dead. If you look into the census data, 2011, our life expectancy is about 66 to 68 years. The people who would probably legitimately remember partition are people who probably at least would need to be more than 78 or 80 years of age. Where are those people? Most of the people are dead. Or even if they're alive, they have gone senile. So how do you recover this kind of narrative? I don't think, and that is why it becomes a very, very difficult task. We need to probably, as students of literature would know, it's important to go back to oral narratives. It's going back to oral history, for the students of history, and biographies, autobiographies. Professor Geraldine Forbes, in her book, Women in Colonial India, in probably one of the last chapters, do point out that one of the most important things that we need to do when we start talking about any kind of a history is to recover the voice of women. how do you recover the voice of women, at least if not through oral history, for women who have not articulated themselves through published, narratives, by going back to them, going back and listening to their stories. There are very, very few autobiographies which we need to recover. And so therefore, as I said, that both students of history and students of literature can actually combine together to rewrite the history of partition in the country. One of the ways in which one of the scholars who have taught us about it is an institution by herself by the name of Urvashi Butalia. Urvashi Butalia did this study of the Punjab. We have really not done a serious study for Bengal and Assam, except one or two small tracts that have come out. But we need a more in-depth study. But unfortunately, most of the people who could have given us the information are either dead or have gone senile.
Okay, sir. There is another question and comment from our college manager. He made a comment that Professor Datta's presentation was very informative. And the question is this, since Burma was a part of India, can we consider the Rohingya issue also a product of partition?
Of course, no doubt about it, because whether it is the Rohingyas, because see, who are if you look into understanding who are the Rohingyas, you will see that the Rohingyas have got subcontinental roots. They're not people who have actually landed up from Mars. They're people who have migrated from what is called Eastern Bengal into what is called Burma. And this process of partition of Burma, which one sees taking place from the 19th century onwards and getting institutionalized in the 20th century, also led to a creation of what is called, a nation state, which is, modeled around Western type of modernity. And the biggest problem of Western modernity driven nations are that it tries to create a homogeneous national character. And this homogeneous national character is constructed on the basis of language, is constructed on the basis of religion, is constructed on the basis of culture. And so this process of homogenization invariably does not treat people who are not part of the mainstream discourse very kindly. Rohingyas are surely not part of the larger contemporary Burmese mainstream discourse, which is essentially extremely hostile to people who do not form part of that mainstream discourse in Burma, and hence Rohingyas have been forced to migrate. I would say this. One of the things, and for the danger of repeating myself, partition brought, whether it's in Burma or it's in India, Bangladesh, or it's in India and Pakistan, partition brought this foreigners dimension into political lexicon. So, Rohingyas who are migrating to either Bangladesh or to India, invariably came to be stigmatized. It becomes a very pejorative term. They are stigmatized by nationality. They are stigmatized because of their religious and cultural background. So therefore, obviously, the Rohingya issue, as much as the question of migration in Northeast India, has become an international issue, an issue of foreigners versus indigenous, as a result of partition. If this entire landscape would have been, as in the pre-colonial, people migrated. Kingdoms had boundaries which were only important for the rulers, for the kings who fought against each other and expanded their territories. But this had nothing to do with migration. For example, if you look at the travel of the Chinese travelers like Huan Sang or Fai Hian, they migrated very easily into India, into Northeast India. Nobody stopped them because it was a common practice for people to migrate across boundaries and go to places of learning, go to universities, interact with people. Traders came, traders migrated. For example, I'm reading a very interesting book called The Silk Roads, and this is by Peter Frankopan. This is not the only book which actually talks about this connectivity. There is a book by Chris Bailey. It's edited by Chris Bailey called Modernity and Culture. And it's an edited book. It's a book which is edited by C.A. Bailey and Leela Fawaz. Leela Fawaz and Chris Bailey. And if you look into these books, or even read the writings of people like Reela Mukherjee, Ashin Dasgupta, they are people who have actually told us that in the pre-colonial period, migration, trade, interaction, development of urban centers, development of shared urban cultures, these are not something which people look down upon, or people were not stigmatized because of migration. The entire question of stigmatization has arisen as a result of partition and imposition, forceful imposition of Western nation states on, Asian civilizational, spaces, geo-civilizational spaces.
Okay, because of the short of time, we are compelled to wind up the session. I am very indebted to Professor Datta for such an enlightening session.